Karen arrived at Flagstaff just a few minutes before the train was scheduled to depart. She was preoccupied with getting her tickets and baggage sorted, and didn't have time to think about herself or the fact that she was leaving Arizona. However, as she stepped onto the Pullman, she overheard a fellow passenger say, "Regular old Arizona sunset," and her heart shook. In that moment, she realized how much she had come to love the colorful sunsets of Arizona, and how she would miss them. She bitterly thought about how she always seemed to learn the value of something only after it was gone. As the train jolted and started moving, Karen felt a singularly depressing shock. She had burned her bridges behind her and had no turning back. Had she secretly hoped that Tristan would change his mind, or that she would have a change of heart? A sense of irreparable loss washed over her, and she felt the first twinges of shame and humiliation. From her window, Karen gazed out to the southwest. Somewhere beyond the cedar and pine-covered hills lay Lost Mule Canyon, slowly drifting into sleep under the purple and gold shadows of the sunset. Banks of broken clouds hung low on the horizon, resembling continents, islands, and reefs in a turquoise sea. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the creamy-edged and purple-centered clouds, and a vast flare of gold dominated the sunset background. As the train rounded a curve, Karen's vision was suddenly filled with the towering San Francisco mountains, the ragged gray slopes of grass, the green forests on end, and the black-fringed skylines all pointed to the sharp, clear peaks that speared the sky. As Karen looked on, the peaks slowly turned red and orange with the setting sun, and the sky burst into a golden blaze, highlighting the majestic mountains. She had been watching these peaks for over 2 months, at every hour and in every mood, and they had become a part of her thoughts without her even realizing it. But now, as the train carried her relentlessly eastward, she knew that soon they would be nothing but a memory. Tears filled her eyes as she regretted not appreciating the beauty and solitude of the mountains sooner. Why had she not understood herself better? The next day, as she traveled through New Mexico, Karen marveled at the magnificent ranges and valleys that were so different from the country she had seen when she was headed west. But it was the sunset of the following day that made her realize the true power of the West. As the train sped down the continental slope of prairie land beyond the Rockies, Karen was drawn to the platform of her car, which was the last in the train. There she stood gripping the iron gate, feeling the wind whip her hair and the ground rush under her feet. The sky was a mass of strange clouds and singular light, casting a luminosity over the green prairie. Karen was spellbound and stricken by the sheer wonder and glory of the firmament and the mountain range that it canopied so exquisitely. A rich and mellow light, singularly clear, seemed to flood out of some unknown source. The sun was hidden, and the clouds just above her hung low, thick and heavy like smoke. They mushroomed, coalesced, formed, and massed of a strange yellow cast of nature. The color shaded westward into heliotrope and then into a purple so royal, so matchless and rare that Karen understood why the purple of the heavens could never be reproduced in paint. As the clouds began to thin and lighten, a rosy hue spread over the billowy, flowery, creamy white. The display continued with a vast canopy of shell pink appearing, resembling a sun-fired surface like an opal sea. The texture was exquisite, akin to that of an oriental fabric, pure, delicate, and lovely, as no human hands could create. It reflected all the warm, pearly tints of the inside whirl of the tropic nautilus, ending abruptly in a rounded depth of bank on a broad stream of clear sky, intensely blue and transparent. The golden lightning of the sunset notched the lower edge of this stream, which stretched horizon long, bordered by the wondrous white, glistening peaked range of the Rockies. Far to the north, standing apart from the range, loomed the grand black bulk and noble white dome of Pikes Peak. Karen watched this sunset transfiguration of cloud, sky, and mountain until all became cold and gray. She returned to her seat, thoughtful and sad, feeling that the West had mockingly flung at her one of its transient moments of loveliness. However, the West was not yet finished with her. The next day, Karen witnessed the mellow gold of the Kansas wheat fields, endless and boundless like a sunny sea, rich, waving in the wind, stretching away before her aching eyes for hours and hours. Here was the promise fulfilled, the bountiful harvest of the land, the strength of the West. The great Middle State had a heart of gold. As Karen journeyed east of Chicago, she began to feel that the long days and nights of riding, the ceaseless turning of the wheels, the constant and wearing stress of emotion, had removed her an immeasurable distance of miles and time and feeling from the scene of her catastrophe. Many days seemed to have passed, and many were the hours of her bitter regret and anguish. The pastoral farms and countless villages of Indiana and Ohio seemed like a different world compared to the bustling cities of the East. Karen felt a sense of relief as she approached her destination, but the long journey had left her feeling tired and uncomfortable in the stuffy train car. The summer heat had taken hold of the lowlands east of the Mississippi, adding to Karen's discomfort. Despite her weariness, Karen was eagerly anticipating her reunion with her aunt and friends, whom she had sent a wire to meet her at Grand Central Station. As the train made its way through Albany, Karen found herself growing increasingly impatient. The sight of the majestic Hudson River and the grandiose mansions lining its shores signaled to Karen that she was back in the East, but everything seemed different somehow. She couldn't tell if she had changed or if it was the world around her that was different. Karen believed that once she had gotten past the ordeal of meeting her friends and was back home, things would start to make sense again. But as the train made its way closer to the city, Karen's emotions were in turmoil. She tried to appear calm and collected like a true New York woman, but inside she felt like a failure, a prodigal child returning to the comfort of loyal friends who didn't truly know her. As the train crossed the Harlem River into New York City, Karen's excitement grew. The familiar landmarks along the way gave her a sense of nostalgia, but there was still something missing. With a rush and a roar, the train finally arrived at its destination, and Karen stepped off, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Karen awoke from her daze and saw the gray apartment buildings and red buildings, the miles of roofs and chimneys, and the hot, bustling streets filled with playing children and cars. Above the noise of the train, she heard the high notes of a hurdy-gurdy and realized she was back home. The train entered a dark tunnel before slowing down and coming to a stop. Karen's legs felt lifeless as she followed a porter up the long incline towards the station gate. A circle of expectant faces greeted her beyond the gate, including her aunt's eager and agitated expression, Eleanor Harmon's handsome pale face, and Beatrice Lovell's sweet thin one. They rushed towards Karen, embracing her and exclaiming in unison. Karen couldn't remember what she said, but her heart was full. "You look stunning," Eleanor exclaimed, gazing at Karen with surprise and joy. "You're young again, like you were in our school days," Beatrice added. Aunt Peggy's piercing gaze made Karen feel uneasy. "Yes, Karen, you look well, better than I ever saw you, but, Aunt Peggy trailed off. "But I don't look happy," Karen interrupted. "I am happy to be home and see you all, but my heart is broken." A moment of silence followed before Karen was led up the wide stairway to the vast, domed, cathedral-like chamber of the station. A strange sensation pierced her with a pang as she climbed the stairs. It wasn't the old thrill of leaving New York or returning, nor was it the sight of the bustling crowd or the beauty of the station. Karen shut her eyes and realized what it was. The vast expanse of space above, the looming gray walls with shadowy figures etched on them, and the lofty dome resembling the blue sky brought back memories of Oak Creek Canyon and the caverns beneath its ramparts. Karen opened her eyes to face her friends, and without wasting any time, she exclaimed, "Let me get it over with quickly. I hated the West. It was too raw, too violent, too big. I think I hate it more now, but it changed me physically and did something to my soul. God knows what. And it saved Tristan. He's wonderful. You wouldn't even recognize him." Karen paused and took a deep breath before continuing. "For a long time I didn't have the courage to tell him that I came to bring him back east. I kept putting it off, but then I rode, climbed, camped, and lived outdoors. At first it nearly killed me, but it became bearable and easier until I forgot. Honestly, I had a wonderful time in spite of everything." Tristan's business was hog-raising, and Karen couldn't help but feel disappointed and expected to ridicule it. However, she ended up respecting him immensely and learned the nobility of work through his hog-raising. I eventually found the courage to ask him when he was coming back to New York, and he said never. I realized then how blind and selfish I was. I couldn't be his wife and live there. I was too small, too miserable, too comfort-loving, and too spoiled. He knew this all along and knew I'd never be big enough to marry him. That broke my heart, and I had to leave him free." Karen begged her friends not to ask her any more questions and to never mention it again so she could forget. The unspoken sympathy of her female friends proved comforting in that trying hour. After Karen had made her confession, the tightness in her chest subsided and her vision cleared. As they stepped outside the station, Karen was hit with a wave of hot, stifling air from the street. She struggled to breathe deeply. "Isn't it unbearably hot?" she asked her companions. "This is a cool day compared to last week," replied Eleanor. "Cool?" exclaimed Karen, wiping the sweat from her face. "I wonder if you people from the East Coast truly understand the meaning of words." They hailed a taxi and were soon careening through the city streets, dodging cars and pedestrians alike. At one point they were caught in a traffic jam at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street. Karen felt a sense of relief at the sight of so many people bustling about their business. Where were they headed? What were their lives like? Her aunt held her hand while Beatrice and Eleanor chattered away. Eventually the taxi turned onto a side street and pulled up in front of Karen's modest 3-story brownstone house. Despite her emotional turmoil, Karen couldn't help but notice the drab, brownish-red color of the stone steps in front of her home. "I'm going to have it painted," she muttered to herself. Her aunt and friends laughed, relieved to hear Karen being practical. Little did they know that the color of the stone reminded Karen of the deserts and canyons she had known out west. Karen entered the house, feeling relieved to be back in her familiar surroundings. She made her way to her room, which looked just as she had left it. As she gazed at herself in the mirror, she couldn't help but notice how tired and dusty she looked. "It's done," she whispered to herself. "I'm home. But what now? Do I go back to my old life or start anew?" She knew she needed to take action and leave the past behind. With determination, she set her mind to the task at hand. The day passed quickly with unpacking, chatting, telephoning, and lunching. Karen went out to dinner with friends and later to a roof garden where she enjoyed the bright lights, music, and laughter. Despite the noise and heat, she found it all to be a welcome distraction. That night she slept soundly, exhausted from the day's activities. The next morning, Karen made a new habit of waking up early and getting a head start on the day. She discussed business matters with her aunt, met with her lawyer and banker, had lunch with Rose Maynard, and spent the afternoon shopping. However, the heat, noise, and crowds of people wore her out so much that she didn't have an appetite for dinner. Despite this setback, she remained determined to make the most of her new life. After chatting with her aunt for a bit, Karen hit the road and drove through Central Park and out of town into Westchester County, hoping to escape the sweltering heat. However, she didn't seem to pay much attention to the dusty trees and worn greens around her. Later in the day, she visited friends, had dinner at home with her aunt, and then went to a theater. Although the musical comedy was good, the unbearable heat and stuffy air ruined her enjoyment. At midnight, as she arrived home, Karen looked up to see the stars, but there were none. The city was covered in a murky, yellow-tinged blackness. Karen realized that city dwellers didn't get to enjoy stars, sunrises, sunsets, fresh air, or silence. She quickly pushed the thought aside and resumed her old routine. Many of her friends couldn't afford to leave the city during the summer, while others were vacationing in the Adirondacks. Karen decided to go to Lake Placid with her aunt in August, but for now she planned to keep herself busy. After a week in the city, Morrison called her, sounding happy and excited. Karen found his enthusiasm irritating, and she wasn't sure she wanted to see him. However, she had already planned to go out with him, so she agreed to meet him for dinner at the plaza. As she hung up the phone, Karen realized that she resented the idea of going to the plaza, but she didn't dwell on the reason why. As Karen walked into the reception room of the plaza that night, Morrison was already waiting for her. He was the same slim, elegant man she remembered, but somehow different. He had what Karen called the New York masculine face, with a blasé and lined expression, and eyes that gleamed but lacked fire. However, when he saw Karen, his face lit up. "By Jove, you've come back a peach," he exclaimed, clasping her hand. "Eleanor told me you looked great. It's worth missing you to see you like this." "Thanks, Larry," Karen replied. "I must look pretty well to win that compliment from you. And how are you feeling? You don't seem robust for a golfer and horseman." "But then I'm used to husky Westerners." "Oh, I'm fagged with the daily grind," he said. "I'll be glad to get up in the mountains next month. Let's go down to dinner." They descended the spiral stairway to the grill room, where an orchestra played jazz and diners in evening dress watched the dancers on the polished floor. "Well, Karen, are you still finicky about the food?" he asked, looking at the menu. "No, but I prefer plain food," she replied. "Have a cigarette," he said, holding out his silver monogrammed case. "Thanks, Larry. I guess I'll not take up smoking again. You see, while I was out west, I got out of the habit." "Yes, they told me you had changed," he replied. "How about drinking?" "Why, I thought New York had gone dry," she said, forcing a laugh. "Only on the surface. Underneath, it's wetter than ever." "Well, I'll obey the law." He ordered an elaborate dinner and then turned his attention back to Karen, giving her a closer scrutiny. Karen knew then that he had become aware of her broken engagement. It was a relief not to have to tell him. "How's that big stiff, Mitterwald?" asked Morrison suddenly. "Did he really recover?" asked Karen, looking down at her plate. "He sure did," replied the man across from her. Karen felt a knot form in her stomach at the mention of him. "But I understand if you don't want to talk about him." Karen had expected Morrison to try and win her over again, but the mere mention of Mitterwald made her feel angry and anxious. It was natural for Tristan's former rivals to speak of him, but she couldn't stand any reference to him from this man. Morrison had avoided serving in the army and had been given a high-paying job despite not doing much work. His father had made a fortune during the war, and Karen remembered Tristan telling her about piles of army goods that were never used. Morrison was one of the many who had gained at the expense of those who had lost, but Karen couldn't see that he had gained anything. She would rather have been a wounded soldier. "Larry, I think gain and loss are just words," she said. "What matters to me is who you are as a person." He looked surprised, but then started talking about a new dance that was popular. They continued to chat about theater gossip throughout dinner, and Morrison even asked Karen to dance at one point. The music was so invigorating that even an Egyptian mummy would have been moved by it, Karen thought. The soft glow of rose lights, the happy chatter of people, and the graceful movements of the dancers were all so thrilling. Morrison was an expert dancer, but he held Karen too tightly. She told him that she needed some fresh air, something that he couldn't provide, having never been out west. She didn't want to be suffocated. During the later part of July, Karen was very busy. She was always with her friends and rarely turned down an invitation. She even went to Coney Island, watched baseball games, and went to the movies, things that were not typical of her. At Coney Island, she had a great time with her two younger friends. She enjoyed the baseball games, with the players running and the fans screaming. However, she didn't like the movies, which she found to be full of salacious and ridiculous representations of life, acted skillfully by some actors and featuring silly scenes with a doll-faced girl in others. She intentionally refused to go horseback riding in Central Park or to the plaza, but she didn't question her reasons for doing so. On August 1st, she went with her aunt and some friends to Lake Placid, where they stayed at a hotel. The green mountains and the serene amber water were a sight for Karen's sore eyes. The cool, fresh air was also very refreshing and relieving after New York's hot, dirty, and crowded atmosphere. She had been pushing herself too hard, living life at a breakneck pace, but the natural beauty around her made it hard to completely forget about rest. Sometimes she just had to take a break and recharge her batteries. Unfortunately, during those times, she couldn't always engage in conversation, read, or write, but most days were filled with a variety of activities that brought her immense pleasure. The place was stunning, the weather was lovely, and the people were friendly. She explored the forest roads in her motor car, paddled along the edges of the lake in her canoe, and played golf and tennis. She dressed in gorgeous gowns for dinner and danced the night away. However, she rarely took walks on the trails, never went alone, and never climbed the mountains or rode horses. Then Morrison arrived and began showering her with attention, just like the other men. Karen didn't really accept or reject their advances. Instead, she preferred the company of married couples and older people, and avoided getting too cozy with vacationers at summer resorts. She'd always enjoyed playing with children, but now she found herself avoiding them, somehow hurt by the sound of their little feet and joyful laughter. She filled her days with activities as best she could and usually slept soundly at night. She put everything she had into the present and tried to make the most of every moment, knowing that time was fleeting. Chapter 9. In late September, Karen made her way back to New York City. Not long after her return, she received a formal marriage proposal from Elbert Harrington. During her stay in Lake Placid, Elbert had been quietly attentive to her. He was a distinguished lawyer, older than most of her friends, and came from a well-off family. Karen was taken aback by the proposal. Elbert was one of the few people she knew who was a bit old-fashioned, and she appreciated that about him. However, she knew that she couldn't marry him and responded to his letter as kindly as possible. Despite her response, Elbert decided to visit Karen in person. "Hey, Karen, I'm here to talk to you about something," he said with a smile in his eyes. He wasn't particularly tall or handsome, but had a strong face that women found attractive. "Elbert, what's up?" Karen replied, trying to brush it off with a laugh. "I'm honored, but I can't marry you." "Why not?" he asked calmly. "Because I don't love you," she replied. "I never expected you to," he said. "I was hoping you might come to care for me in time. I've known you for a long time, Karen. I can see that you're breaking down. Maybe you don't need a husband right now, but you need a home and children. You're wasting your life." "Everything you're saying might be true, Elbert," Karen said with a helpless shrug. "But that doesn't change the way I feel." "But you'll have to marry someday, won't you?" he persisted. This straightforward question caught Karen off guard. It made her think of things she had tried to bury. "I don't think I ever will," she replied thoughtfully. "That's nonsense, Karen," he said firmly. "You'll have to marry eventually. What else are you going to do? With all due respect to your feelings, that thing with Mitterwald is over, and you're not the type of girl to wallow in heartbreak." "You can never tell what a woman will do," Karen said a bit coldly. "That's true," he agreed. "That's why I won't take no for an answer. Karen, be reasonable. You like me and respect me, don't you?" "Of course I do," Karen replied. "I'm only 35, and I can give you everything a sensible woman wants," he said. "Let's start a real American home. Have you thought about that, Karen? Something's not right these days. Men aren't marrying, and women aren't having children. None of my friends have a real American home." Karen was in a state of distress. It was a terrible fact that weighed heavily on her mind. However, she knew better than to be a sentimentalist or a melancholiac. She was not one to waste her time, for she possessed fine qualities. What she needed was something to do and someone to care for. Elbert had tried to reason with her, but Karen was steadfast in her answer. She was not ungrateful, nor was she insensitive to the truth of what he had said. Nevertheless, her answer was a resounding no. After Harrington had left, Karen retreated to her room. She stood before her mirror just as she had done when she had returned from Arizona. She looked at herself skeptically and with a sense of relentlessness. "I am such a liar that I'll do well to look at myself," she thought to herself. "Here I am again. Now, the world expects me to marry. But what do I expect?" Karen's heart was raw and unheated. She seldom allowed herself to think about it, let alone to probe it with hard materialistic queries. But custom was as inexorable to her as life. If she chose to live in the world, she must conform to its customs. For a woman, marriage was the aim, the end, and the all of existence. However, for Karen, it could not be without love. Her love and perception had broadened out west, and now her arraignment of herself and her sex was bigger, sterner, and more exacting. The months she had been home seemed fuller than all the months of her life. She had tried to forget and enjoy, but she had not succeeded. Instead, she had looked with far-seeing eyes at her world. Tristan Mitterwald's tragic fate had opened her eyes. Either the world was all wrong or the people in it were. But if that were an extravagant and erroneous supposition, there certainly was proof positive that her own small individual world was wrong. The women did not do any real work. They did not bear children. They lived on excitement and luxury. They had no ideals. Karen wondered how greatly men were to blame for this. Karen questioned her own judgment as she pondered the role of women in men's lives. She believed that men could not survive without the love, companionship, and smiles of women. It was only natural for men to give women what they wanted, as they had no other choice. Karen wondered how much genuine love existed in her acquaintances' marriages. Before getting married, Karen had always desired a girl who was proud, aloof, and had a heart of gold. Such traits were only attainable through love, which made it better for no children to be born at all unless born out of genuine love. Perhaps that was why so few children were born, as nature had its own way of balancing things out. Karen had learned about the ruthlessness and inevitability of nature during her time in Arizona. She was learning many other staggering facts about life. As she faced her reflection in the mirror, Karen whispered with trembling lips that she still loved Tristan. She loved him even more now, and the truth was terrible to bear. Karen knew that she could not marry another man, as it would make her a liar and a cheat. If only she could forget about Tristan or kill her love for him, she might be able to love another man. Without such love, however, she would only be able to offer a mere shell of herself. For Karen, love was the sacred and holy flame of life that gave meaning to the begetting of children. Marriage might be necessary in modern times, but it was not the most critical issue. Karen's anguish revealed strange and hidden truths. Nature had a way of striking a terrible balance and taking revenge on those who had no children or who brought children into the world without the divinity of love. Such children were unyearned for and doomed to carry the burdens of life. Karen came to the realization that it was right and true for her to give herself to a man she loved, even if he was inferior, as long as she had that natural love of a woman. On the other hand, it was false and sinful for her to marry a man who was the greatest, richest, or noblest, if she didn't have that supreme love to give him and know it was reciprocated. "What am I going to do with my life?" she asked, feeling bitter and shocked. "I've been a wasteful person. I've lived for nothing but pleasurable sensations. I'm completely useless and do no good on earth." Harrington's words rang true for her, and they brought about a crisis that she had been unconsciously preparing for. Why not give up on my ideals and be like everyone else, she thought to herself. This was one of the things that seemed wrong with modern life, but she pushed the thought away with passionate scorn. If Tristan Mitterwald, who was poor, broken, and ruined, could cling to an ideal and fight for it, then couldn't she, who had everything the world deemed worth having, be woman enough to do the same? Her thoughts had shifted, and she had been ready for rebellion. 3 months of her old life had shown her that it was empty, vain, and farcical, without any redeeming qualities. The naked truth was brutal, but it brought her to a wholesome consciousness. The so-called social life that she had plunged into to forget her unhappiness had failed her completely. If she had been shallow and frivolous, it might have been different. Stripped of all pretense, her actions would have been seen by a penetrating and impartial judge as a mere display of her decorated self before a group of males with the ultimate goal of choosing one. "I have to find some work," she muttered soberly, realizing that it was time to make a change and find a purpose in life. As Karen sat in her home, she heard the postman's whistle outside. Shortly after, her servant brought up her mail. Among the letters was a large, soiled, and thick envelope with the postmark Flagstaff and Tristan Mitterwald's handwriting. Karen was stunned. Her heart raced and her hand shook as she stared at it. She sat down, feeling weak in the knees. "Tristan has written me," she exclaimed, struggling to comprehend. "But why?" The other letters fell off her lap, but Karen was fixated on the thick envelope. It was one of the stamped envelopes she had seen in his cabin. It contained a letter that had been written on his crude table before the open fire, in the light of the doorway, in that little log cabin under the spreading pines of Westford Canyon. She wondered if she dared to read it. As the shock to her heart passed, she felt a wild gladness fill her being. She tore the envelope apart and read, "Dear Karen, I'm glad for a good excuse to write you. Once in a blue moon I get a letter, and today Vandermeer brought me one from a soldier friend of mine who was with me in the Argonne. His name is Virgil Rust. A queer name, isn't it? He's from Wisconsin, a rough diamond sort of chap, but fairly well educated. He and I were in some pretty hot places, and it was he who pulled me out of a shell crater. I'd have gone west for sure then if it hadn't been for Rust. Well, he did all sorts of big things during the war. Was down several times with wounds. He liked to fight, and he was a holy terror. We all thought he'd get medals and promotion, but he didn't get either. These much-desired things did not always go where they were best deserved. Rust is now lying in a hospital in Bedford Park." The letter he sent me was a sad one. It was written in blue ink, and he didn't say much about why he was there, only that he was knocked out. But he did talk a lot about his girl. Apparently he was in love with a girl from his hometown, a pretty girl with big eyes whose picture I've seen. And while he was away, she married someone who didn't go to war. Rust is really hurt by this. He wrote, "I wouldn't care so much if she had married an old man or a boy who couldn't have gone to war. You see, Karen, servicemen feel a certain way about things like that. It's something we picked up over there, and it's something we'll never get over. Anyway, the reason I'm writing to you is because I want you to go see Rust. He needs someone to cheer him up and do what they can for him. I know it's a lot to ask, especially since Rust has seen your picture and knows you used to be my girl. But you don't have to tell him that we couldn't make it work. And while I'm at it, I should tell you that I miss writing to you more than anything else. I bet you have a whole trunk full of letters from me, unless you've thrown them away. I won't say how much I miss your letters, but I will say that you wrote the most charming and fascinating letters of anyone I ever knew. You knew that I didn't have any other girl correspondent, right? Well, I managed without you before you came to Lost Mule, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't get lonely for you and your letters. It's different now that you've been here. I spend most of my days alone, lost in my own thoughts and dreaming of things that may never come to pass. But sometimes, Karen, I see you everywhere I look, in my cabin by the brook, under the pines, riding calico just like you used to. It's like you're haunting me, but I can't help but smile at the memories. Don't get me wrong, I'm not down in the dumps or anything. I'll take my medicine like a man. But you spoiled me, Karen, and I miss hearing from you. It wouldn't hurt to get a friendly letter every once in a while, would it? It's autumn now, and Arizona is putting on a show. The canyons are bursting with color, from the golden aspen thickets halfway up the San Francisco peaks to the blazing vines and maples in the canyon below. Even the oak leaves are turning a beautiful russet gold, and the sycamores are a bright yellow green. And just the other day I stumbled upon a patch of asters so beautiful I had to dig them up and plant them by my cabin. I find myself home early most afternoons now, just loafing around and enjoying the peace and quiet. I know it's not good for me, but I can't bring myself to hunt or fish anymore. The trout in the pool by my cabin are practically eating out of my hand, and the squirrels have grown so tame and friendly that one even climbs up on my table. And there's a chipmunk who lives in my cabin and runs over my bed, but I don't mind. It's nice to have a little company, even if it's just the furry kind. I have a new addition to my household, a little pig that you named Pinky. Once you gave him his name and petted him, I knew I couldn't leave him to live like an ordinary pig. So I brought him home with me. At first my dog Mose was jealous and didn't like having Pinky around, but now they are good friends and even sleep together. Joyce has a kitten that she's going to give me soon, and then I'll be all set, as Vandermeer says, and Jake. Some might think that my leisure activities are idle or silly, but I believe you'll understand. Sometimes it's nice to do nothing and just experience a moment of supreme joy in the simple act of thinking nothing. Tennyson's Lotus Eaters comes close to capturing this feeling. Sometimes all I need is to see or feel something to be content. I like to lay down on the warm, fragrant pine needles and breathe in the scent of the earth. It's a peaceful moment that makes me feel less alone. Although I can't see the sunset, I watch for its arrival on the eastern wall of the canyon. I see the shadow slowly creeping up, driving the golden light before it until the canyon rim and pines are turned to a golden fire. I watch the eagles soaring across the sky, their wings cutting through the golden light before disappearing into the blue. As the golden flush fades to gray, the canyon slowly fills with purple shadows. This hour of twilight is a silent and melancholy one. There's seldom any sound except for the soft rush of water over the stones, which seems to fade away. For a moment I feel like Hiawatha in his forest home, or a primitive savage, feeling the great silent pulse of nature. It's a happy, unconscious feeling, like a beast of the wild. But it's fleeting, and I'm quickly brought back to reality. My name is Tristan Mitterwald, and I hail from West Fork. I am plagued with memories of the past, haunting me day and night. As I gaze upon the towering walls that surround me, I see them as pages in a book, chronicling my life from its beginning to its inevitable end. The stones that make up these walls hold the secrets of time, and the stream that flows beside me murmurs a melancholic tune that speaks of the ebb and flow of human life, with all its joys and sorrows. But I cannot dwell on these thoughts for too long, for there is work to be done. I must put aside my musings and attend to the mundane tasks of everyday life. I heave a sigh, gather my strength, and head inside to make biscuits and fry ham. Before I do so, however, I must mention the image that often appears before me. The walls and crags that loom above me weave a tapestry of shadows, conjuring up the face of Karen Oakman. Her beauty is unforgettable, and I cannot help but be captivated by her image. As for news from Lost Mule, there is little to report. My pig was once again stolen by that cursed bald eagle. However, my hog-raising business is thriving, and Vandermeer has expressed interest in joining me by investing in his sheep. I have also heard rumors that someone has bought the Deep Lake section that I had my eye on for a ranch. Vandermeer was tight-lipped about the identity of the buyer. Charlie, the herder, had a strange episode where he claimed to have received a letter from someone named Andy. I know not who this person is, but Charlie seemed quite proud of the correspondence. Joyce and Lee Stanton had yet another quarrel, with Joyce resorting to underhanded tactics to provoke Lee. Women can be quite unpredictable, I have found. In any case, Karen, I bid you adios and implore you to write to me. Yours truly, Tristan. Karen read the letter twice, savoring every word and lingering over certain passages. The image of her face, sculpted by the shadows of the canyon walls, thrilled her to the core. She couldn't contain her excitement and leaped up, letting out an unutterable cry. All the pain and turmoil she had endured for weeks seemed to vanish in an instant. "He loves me still," she whispered, clutching her chest and laughing with wild exultation. It was as if she had just discovered she was loved for the first time. This was the shibboleth, the cry that unlocked the depths of her love and called to the insatiable vanity of a woman. Suddenly, Karen realized the import of Tristan's request and rushed to the telephone to find the number of the hospital in Bedford Park. A nurse answered and informed her that visitors were welcome at certain hours. Karen drove out to the hospital, a long one-story frame structure that had been hastily erected to care for injured soldiers. The nurse admitted her into a small, bare anteroom. Karen explained her mission, and the nurse was pleased to hear that she wanted to see Rust. "Some of these boys are going to die," she said, "and some will be worse off if they live. But Rust may get well if he behaves. You're a relative or friend?" Karen shook her head. "I don't know him," she said. Karen was led by a nurse into a long, narrow room with single beds lining each side. There were stoves at each end and a few chairs scattered about. The beds all appeared to have occupants, but those closest to Karen were eerily quiet. At the far end of the room were soldiers on crutches, wearing bandages on their heads and arms in slings. Despite their sad appearance, their merry voices filled the room, creating a discordant contrast. Eventually, Karen stopped beside a bed and looked down at a gaunt, haggard young man propped up on pillows. "Rust, a lady to see you," announced the nurse. It was difficult for Karen to introduce herself. Had Tristan ever looked like this? The scars on his face only emphasized the pain etched into his features. The young man had unnaturally bright, dark eyes and a flush of fever in his hollow cheeks. "How do?" he said with a wan smile. "Who are you?" "I'm Tristan Mitterwald's fiancée," Karen replied, holding out her hand. "Say, I ought to have known you," he said eagerly, the gray shade of his face changing to a warmth of light. "You're the girl, Karen. You're almost like my own girl. By golly, you're some looker. It was good of you to come. Tell me about Tristan." Karen took the chair brought by the nurse and pulled it close to the bed. She smiled down at him and said, "I'll be glad to tell you all I know presently. But first you tell me about yourself. Are you in pain? What is your trouble? You must let me do everything I can for you and these other men." Karen spent a poignant and depth-stirring hour at Tristan's comrade's bedside. Eventually, she learned from loyal lips the nature of Tristan Mitterwald's service to his country. Karen held close to her heart the admiration she had for the man she loved and the proof of his selflessness. Rust was not one to boast about his own service, but Karen saw the truth in his face. He was like Tristan. Karen understood the spirit and sacrifice of the legion of boys who had fought for American traditions. Their legacy would be carried on by their children and their children's children. Some things could never die in the hearts and blood of a race. These boys and the girls who loved them were the ones who would revive the Americanism of their forefathers. The slackers, cowards, and those who made excuses would be taken care of by nature and God. Karen saw two forces in life, destructive and constructive. On one side was greed, selfishness, and materialism, while on the other was generosity, sacrifice, and idealism. She saw men as wolves, sharks, snakes, and vermin opposed to lions and eagles. Karen also saw women who did not inspire men to seek, imagine, dream, hope, work, and fight. She began to understand what a woman could be. That night, Karen wrote a letter to Tristan, pouring out her heart onto the pages. She wrote feverishly, but ultimately destroyed the letter. Her feelings were too raw, and she couldn't keep them from seeping into her words. She wrote until late into the night and finally composed a letter that felt insincere, only mentioning news of Tristan's comrade and her own friends. "I ain't never writin' him again," Karen declared with a stern expression, though she couldn't help but find the situation ironic. Tristan's letter had shattered any courage she had left, but was that courage even genuine? It was just a way to hide her pain and protect her future without any thought for others. She felt ashamed when she realized she would write to Tristan over and over again, but then overwhelmed with love soon after. It was like she had moved beyond her former self, who had tried so hard to forget him. Even if it killed her, she would keep thinking of him. Karen was grasping at straws, trying to find some relief from the constant nagging in her mind. For months she had tried to forget, but it was all for nothing. Finally, she surrendered to the memories. She would stop trying to get over Tristan and let herself think and dream about him as much as she wanted. It was the only happiness she could have. Surrendering to this change was so new and refreshing that she felt renewed for days. She also visited the hospital in Bedford Park often, bringing joy and relief to Virgil Rust and his comrades. Karen was invested in the well-being and future of the seriously injured soldiers and spent a lot of time and effort helping them. She tried to recruit others with resources and time to help the boys, but it didn't work out. Several weeks went by and some soldiers were discharged, but Rust's condition didn't improve much. Karen received news from both the nurse and doctor that Rust brightened up when she visited him, but when she wasn't around he became indifferent and didn't care about his well-being or whether he ate or not. Rust had expressed concern about what would happen to him if he made it out alive. Karen realized that Rust's pain was more than just the loss of his leg and decided to talk to him earnestly to try and give him hope. Rust had developed a deep respect for Karen, so she waited for the right moment to speak to him privately. Initially, Rust tried to laugh it off, then tried to deceive her, but eventually he opened up and showed her his true feelings. "I appreciate your offer to help me get into business with your kind friends, but I don't want charity," Rust said. "I'm grateful that someone recognizes what I've given, but I don't want to be a burden. I'm tired of the game. I wish the Boches had done a better job." Karen was quick to remind Rust that his words were morbid and that he needed to focus on the positive. She encouraged him to fight for himself and to see the brighter side of life. Rust countered her by saying that he was only half a man now. "You can be just as much a man as ever," Karen said, trying to smile through her own tears. "Could you care for a man with only one leg?" "What a question! Of course I could!" Karen exclaimed. "Well, maybe you're different," Rust said, unsure of himself. "Tristan always swore that even if he was killed, no slacker or rich guy left at home could ever steal his girl. Maybe you don't realize how important it is for us guys to have loyal and faithful girls. But let me tell you, Karen, us guys who went overseas saw some strange things when we came back. The good old U.S. needs a lot of faithful girls right now, believe me." "Indeed, that's true," replied Karen. "It's a tough time for everyone, especially you boys who have lost so much." "I lost everything except my life, and I wish to God I had lost that," he replied gloomily. "Oh, don't say that," pleaded Karen, distressed. "Forgive me, Rust, if I hurt you, but Tristan wrote me that you lost your girl. I'm so sorry. It must be terrible for you now. But if you get better, go back to work and pick up where you left off. Your pain will ease with time, and you'll find happiness again." "Never for me in this world," he said. "But why, Rust? You're intelligent and brave. Why isn't there anything left for you?" "Because something inside me has died," he replied, placing his hand over his heart. "Your faith? Your love for everything? Did the war kill it?" "I had gotten over that, maybe," he said drearily, with his somber eyes staring off into space. "But she half murdered it, and they finished it off." "They? Who do you mean, Rust?" "I mean the people I lost my leg for," he replied, his voice soft and terrible. "Not the British or the French." Karen was bewildered. "Then who?" "No one," he cried, turning his face to the wall. Karen dared not ask him more. She was shocked. All her sympathy seemed helpless and impotent. She no longer felt an impersonal, however kindly, interest in this man. His last words had linked her to his misfortune and suffering. He suddenly turned away from the wall, and she could see the agony etched onto his thin, shadowed face. Karen saw it differently. If not for the beautiful softness of light in his eyes, she would not have been able to bear looking at him any longer. "Karen, I'm bitter," he said, struggling to swallow. "But I'm not callous and heartless like some of the other guys. I know if you were my girl, you would have stood by me." "Yes," Karen whispered. "That makes a difference," he continued, his smile sad. "You see, we soldiers all had feelings, and there was one thing we all felt the same way about. We were going to fight for our homes and our women. I should say women first. No matter what we read or heard about standing by our allies, fighting for liberty or civilization, the truth was we all felt the same, even if we never said it out loud. Tristan fought for you. I fought for Nell. We weren't going to let the Huns treat you the way they treated French and Belgian girls. And think, Nell was engaged to me, she loved me, and yet she married a slacker while I lay half dead on the battlefield. She wasn't worth loving or fighting for," Karen said, her voice shaking. "Ah, now you've said something," he declared. "If I can only hold on to that truth. What does one girl matter? I don't count. It's the sum that counts. We love America, our homes, our women. Karen, you've given me comfort and strength through your support. Tristan will have his reward in your love. Somehow I feel like I share it a little. Poor Tristan. He got what he deserved too. Why, Karen, that guy wouldn't even let you do what he could do for you. He was cut to pieces." "Please, Russ, don't say any more. I am unstrung," Karen pleaded. "Why not? You deserve to know how splendid Tristan was. I tell you, Karen, all the boys here love you for the way you've stood by Tristan. Some of them knew him, and I've told the rest. We thought he would never survive. But he did, and we know how you helped. Going out west to see him. He didn't write it to me, but I know. I'm smart. I'm happy for him, the lucky guy. Next time you go out west." "Quiet!" cried Karen. She couldn't take it any more. She couldn't keep lying. "You're pale, you're shaking," exclaimed Rust, concerned. "Oh, what did I say? Forgive me. Rust, I'm no more deserving of love and dedication than your Nell." "What?" he exclaimed. "I haven't been honest with you," she said quickly. "I let you believe a lie. I'll never marry Tristan. I ended my engagement with him." Rust slowly sank back on the pillow, his large, luminous eyes piercingly fixed on her as if he could see into her soul. "I went west, yes," Karen continued, "but it was selfish. I wanted Tristan to come back here. He suffered like you did. He almost died. But he fought. Oh, he went through hell. And after a long, slow, terrible struggle, he began to heal. He worked. He raised hogs. He lived alone. He worked harder and harder. The West and his work saved his body and soul. He learned to love both the West and his work. I didn't blame him, but I couldn't live there. He needed me, but I was too small, too selfish. I couldn't marry him. I gave him up. I left him alone." Karen recoiled under the scorn in Rust's eyes. "And there's another man," he said, "a pure, straight, unblemished guy who wouldn't fight." "Oh, no, I swear there isn't," Karen whispered. "You too," he replied thickly. Then slowly he turned his worn, dark face to the wall. His fragile chest heaved, and his thin hand made her a slight, dismissive gesture, meaningful and commanding. Karen fled. Her whole being was racked with convulsions, and a deadly feeling of faintness overtook her, causing her to feel sick and chilled to the bone. Chapter 10.